We are, thank you. You'll have heard that a message that we are recording today's session to be able to include it in our gender equity toolbox. So you'll hear a little bit, or toolkit, you'll hear a little bit more about that later. So we are focused in on two topics within this outcome evaluation category. And these were developed based on some research that we did at the very beginning of our process. It started about 2.5 years ago, actually, through a series of interviews and a literature review and an advisory committee that we struck, and got some really good input on what were the areas around gender equity that people in the field were most interested in. And so what we've come to is using good questions. And so we're going to work our way through that through each of the pieces today, and also using the best data. So looking at outcome related data and what that might entail. Let me just check here. Okay, so we're good on that. Okay, so let me just take you through a few of the technology pieces to support today's call. One is that we are hoping that in the workshop realm of today's session, that we are going to ask for your participation frequently throughout the session, and we're going to try some what might be some new technology for many of you. It's called a mural board, and so we're going to try that out a few times over the course of today. And we have MJ with us from CPRA, who's going to be a tremendous help to us in that way. So when it is the opportunity to either speak or share on the mural board, please take the opportunity to participate to whatever degree that you're comfortable with and that you would like. If you can keep yourself on mute, which I think most of you are at this point, until we want to have some conversation, that would be helpful as well. This one is always a bit of a struggle. It's so nice to see people's faces when we're leading a session like this. And then I know not everybody's prepared to do that, or some are not able to do that. But if you do feel comfortable to put your video on, it's a lot easier to facilitate a workshop, especially when we can see who we're talking to. So feel free to please do that if you can. I think most of you got your names on the sign in here. Feel free to add your pronouns to that if you would like to. Just a little bit on the view that you might be looking at. When the slides are up in front of you, there's a little bar that delineates the slide side from the picture side. And if you want to make one side larger than the other, you can just slide that bar from left to right and make whichever side you want larger. We will be circulating the slides, or actually not circulating, we're going to post them to the CPR website after the session, both in English and French, if you're interested in grabbing those. And we'd ask two things of you with some of the sub points within a Zoom platform. One is to restrict and putting URLs into the chat box unless you're absolutely clear or sure that it's a secure link. We have often found viruses and things that sometimes get attached to those links. And then lastly, in terms of the participation aspect of all of this, because I can't see faces for the most part, I won't be able to know when you're actually raising your hand. So if you do have a comment to make, either throw your video up so I can see, or use the icon bar down at the bottom of your screen that looks like the one you see on the slide here. And there's a toggle function of raise hand. And then when you're finished with your comment or question, you can lower your hand then at that point as well. And it should be under something called reactions. It's one of the choices within there. So before I go any further, is there anyone having difficulty at all with any aspect of the technology before we get running? No, we're good. Okay. I would also like to introduce Claire Tucker-Reid to the rest of the group. Some of you may have participated in Claire's workshops that are also part of our gender equity series, one on community engagement and the other one looking at organizational culture. And so Claire's been with us for about probably better part of a year working on these 2 rounds of the workshop. So Claire's going to help facilitate some of our discussion today, and certainly welcome to chime in as we go along. So thanks for being here, Claire. All right, let's jump into things with a little bit of an introduction here. We're going to have an overview by Erin Love, who works with CPRA. So I'll just start the video here.
Hi, and welcome. My name is Erin Love. I'm the Director of National Programs at the Canadian Parks and Recreation Association. I'm very pleased to welcome you today to the Gender Equity in Recreational Sport Workshop Series, focusing on optimizing facility use and design. These workshops are a culmination of efforts that over the last year and a bit have involved an environmental scan, literature review, key informant interviews, and surveys involving researchers and recreation practitioners across Canada and internationally. Before we begin, I'd like to give you a brief introduction to CPRA and the work that we're doing focusing on gender equity in recreational sport. As many of you may know, the Canadian Parks and Recreation Association is the national organization dedicated to realizing the full potential of parks and recreation as major contributors to community health and vibrancy. CPRA is a voice. We're the national voice for parks and recreation, advancing the collective interests of our members. CPRA is a community. We're a national network dedicated to the well-being of people, communities in the natural and built environments. We are also a resource. So CPRA is a resource for the sector, and we contribute knowledge and opportunities to enhance growth. We'll talk a little bit more about that as well as I introduce the bench to you in a few slides. What makes CPRA so special is that we are a collective network of the 13 provincial and territorial parks and recreation associations across Canada. They make up our membership, and our strength really comes from the experience, the expertise, and the network of the staff and board members that we have across this great country. We also work with volunteers, government partners, a number of allied health sector partners as well, such as public health, education, sport, physical activity, and a whole host of other groups. They help us progress on our goals, and in turn, we strive to help them meet theirs. CPRA has a virtual office with about 8 staff. And although the staff work remotely, the CPRA National Office is located on the unceded traditional territory of the Algonquin and Métis First Nations. We acknowledge the historical oppression of the lands, cultures, and the peoples in what we now know as Canada. And we aim to contribute to the healing and decolonizing journey that we all share together. So a moment ago, I referenced the bench. The bench is an online community that CPRA launched in the summer of 2020. It's a place for the sector to meet, to grow, to work, to share together. And the bench features a whole host of different tools and resources. It's an events or a list of upcoming events. There are discussion groups, one in particular that's focused on gender equity. There are portals dedicated to specific projects, such as the Framework for Recreation in Canada and Parks for All. There are some professional development opportunities, and as well as COVID-19 and other resources. As the bench grows, you'll also find other discussion groups start to pop up. So we really encourage you to sign up for the bench, take a look around, join some discussion forums if some spark your interest. You'll also find some templates, some tools, some guidelines, and other documents to help you in the work that you're doing. And here's a video of the bench. CPRA's current project that focuses on gender equity in recreational sport was funded back in November 2019. This funding came from the Government of Canada, from Sport Canada at the time, to increase participation and retention of women and girls in recreational sport in Canada. Through our work and over the past few years, we still, of course, focus on girls and women, but we've included non-binary folks as well in the work that we do. Our key populations for this work are girls aged 9 to 15, new moms or women in the postpartum period, older adults 55 and up, as well as girls and women with intersecting identity factors. And what we know is that these key priority groups face additional barriers to participation and retention. And the work that we're doing helps to address those and remove them. CPRA, as part of this work, has designed and delivered a number of different pieces to this project. So there is a facility use and design toolkit, of which this webinar series will be a part. There are other workshops that we've delivered in partnership with Canadian Women in Sport and some local facilitators across the country. We have also delivered a webinar series. You'll find all of this on our website and on our YouTube page. We've worked as well with High Five. Many of you may know the High Five training program, and we've enhanced High Five Sport module and also developed 4 new modules that practitioners can take. They're free, and I encourage you to check those out as well. We've also offered some community grants through this work. Those have gone to grassroots efforts across Canada to address those barriers that women, girls, and non-binary people face when participating in sport and recreation. There's a whole host of work that CPRA is doing in this area, and we would like to thank our partner, the Government of Canada, for funding to do all of these initiatives. This funding or this project supports the 2018 federal funding commitment to achieve gender equity in sport at every level by 2035. So with that, I will turn it over to my colleague and our workshop facilitator. I wish you all the best on this webinar, and I look forward to seeing you all on the bench.
Thank you, Erin, even though she can't hear me. I wanted to find out if anybody has any questions about any of the information that Erin shared just now. Anything you want to ask or add to? Nope, we're good. All right, let's press on then. I wanted to point you to the resources that we'll work with over the course of the afternoon or the time we have today, depending on what time zone you're in. These were sent by email, I think on Thursday of last week. So you will have a planning worksheet that we'll reference a little bit later, as well as a document called the temperature check, which comes from the Canadian Women in Sport group. As I mentioned, you'll get the slides following available on the CPRA website, and then the workbook that we're going to work through today, not all of it, but we'll work through a few of the steps, has been provided to you as well in 2 formats. One is a PDF, and the other is in a version that you can actually work with electronically to fill in with your own information. And it does originate from the CDC in the US and is specific to physical activity, but not specifically around gender equity. So it kind of gets us halfway there in terms of our topic for today. To get us started in the experiencing this technology called Mural, I'm going to turn things over to MJ, who's going to ask a straightforward question, and you'll have a chance to play with it a little bit, and we'll see how it works before we start using it as a workshop tool. So MJ, over to you.
Thank you very much, Nancy. Hello, everyone. I've just posted a link in the chat, which will allow you to access the Miro board. And I will go ahead and also share my screen so that you can see what I see. I can see lots of people joining the Miro board. So once you're on the Miro board, we'll wait for a few more people to join. You can navigate to Icebreaker 1. So I'm going to turn on my sheet. So if you want to follow me to here, In this particular sheet, we just want to know where you're joining us from, and that would give you an opportunity to use this sheet. So once you get here, you can click in one of the little circles and start to type where you're from. I'm joining from Toronto, so I'm going to put Toronto, Ontario. If you're joining us from elsewhere in the country, please put your city and your province in there. So get out of this sheet so someone else can join. Great. I'm seeing lots of people have fun with this sheet. If you have any questions, please do ask me. You can unmute yourself or you can put it in the chat.
And to be able to see it a little larger, you can scroll like a zoom button in and out on your own screen. And the area that you're focused in on will get larger.
Yes, and if you're struggling using like a mouse, if you're joining from a desktop, if you just navigate to this corner of your screen, you see navigation settings. If you click on there, you'll be able to use your trackpad or your mouse. So I'm using a mouse, which is why I have it in this mode. If you switch to trackpad, you will be able to pinch to zoom and use your two fingers to move across the screen. And if you're currently using a trackpad but prefer a mouse, just click on here and you'll be able to use the scroll settings on your mouse. Also, you have this little move mode, like a hand button next to the navigation. If I click on here, it allows me to move on the screen much easier. And then just don't forget to turn off the move mode so that you can click in here.
So we do have people from all across the country. This is great. Does anyone have any questions with the mural, of being able to do this entering of text on here? Because this is a feature that we're going to come back to and use a few times. Anybody having difficulty?
I don't see any questions in the chat. So I'll stop sharing my screen and pass it over back to you, Nancy.
Okay, thank you. All right. Do you see my slides now, or do I need to start sharing again? No, you don't. Okay, thank you. I will come back to here. And
yep, now we have your slides.
Perfect. Okay, so we'll have some more fun with that. Thanks, MJ, as we go along. So give you a quick overview of what the session today will focus in on. We'll give you a brief introduction to the whole topic of gender equity, is particularly around recreational sport. And then in the evaluation theme for today, we'll look at an overview of some of the terminology related to evaluation, and then hone in on the outcome type of evaluation. And from our workbook, we're going to work our way through steps 1 through at least 3, maybe step 4, depending on how much time we have. And then throughout, I've got 2 or 3 different kind of case studies to look at in terms of the outcome evaluations that have been attached to a few relevant projects. So with that in mind, I would encourage you to, throughout the session, ask questions, share examples of your own, recommend resources that might come up that you're familiar with that others may not be. Use that chat function as much as you'd like to share ideas with one another, or do that raised hand and I'll know to open it up for some conversation. So this introduction to gender equity and the whole notion of engaging women, girls, and people with non-diverse or diverse gender in recreational sport. You heard Aaron mention this at the end of the video, that we do have a goal that's been set across the country for 2035 to look at encouraging or supporting gender equity in all levels of sport across Canada. So that's a pretty daunting task, but it's a welcome one in that people have been working away at this topic for quite some time, and we're not making terribly great inroads in it. And so there's still lots of work to be done. And my hope is that that's why you're all here today, is to get some more ideas and some more tools and tips to be able to take some of those steps. Just a few other kind of backdrop statistics, facts and stats that I'll share with you. We know that 62% of Canadian girls are not participating in any kind of sport. In 1992, just over half of women aged 15 and older were participating. But by 2020, that participation dropped to 18% of women within the age group of 16 to 23. So we're in fact going backwards on some of these things. A similar number of boys and girls start out in sport, but more boys stay involved in sport through to late adolescence and across the lifespan. In fact, 1 in 3 girls drop out of sport versus 1 in 10 boys. Some of the factors that prevent girls from participating include low confidence, negative body image, poor perceptions of belonging, and feeling unwelcome. We're going to come back to that in a little bit more detail in a few minutes with respect to these particular factors. I've included the source for these statistics. If you're looking for these kinds of things, often if you're putting together a briefing note or having to make the case for resource allocation, having these kinds of statements can be quite helpful to position the issue. Similarly, currently 1 in 4 females are not committed to returning to sport after COVID-19. People get into different habits or so in some cases it's about feeling safe in larger groups of people. So for a number of different reasons, we're seeing even a further kind of backslide at this point in time. Women tend to be less physically active than men, with 53% of men taking at least 7,500 steps a day, while only 46% of women do so. The same is true of those obtaining at least 150 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity per week, which is our national physical activity guideline, one of them. And again, these come from the government of Canada. So here's where I wanted to pause a little bit longer on this idea of the factors as to why. And this information was generated through Sport England and a woman by the name of Lisa O'Keefe, who is cool title. She's the director of Insight. And I just learned today actually that she's leaving Sport England. So it will be a big gap to fill on their part. But through research, really digging into the population and what their values are, talking to people in a very qualitative kind of way, they came to understand and identify 3 components of this fear that women have around physical activity, sport, recreation, whatever heading or umbrella term you want to use. So it's this, what they've found since then is that this is truly universal. It's fresh, meaning that the context is that it's kind of new information, but it's also a bit startling and can really tug at some emotions, particularly if you're woman or girl yourself. So what the overall theme is that there is a fear of judgment that comes from these 3 perspectives. The first one is being judged on their ability to do whatever the activity is. And that could be as much because they're too good as it is that they are at a very beginner level on something. So that fear of judgment based on their skill level. The second one is worrying about being judged on their appearance during and after exercise. And Lisa tells a story about a woman who didn't consider herself to be very sporty, as they say. And so Lisa was talking in more detail with her about, well, what does she do? Well, I run 4 miles at a time, 2 or 3 times a week. And oh, wow, tell me about that 4 miles. That sounds pretty amazing to me. And in fact, what it was is her route was actually 3 miles, but because she had people that were kind of commenting on her as she ran past at a certain point on her route, she decided to avoid that altogether and added another mile onto, or maybe even kilometer, onto her route to avoid that. So even someone who's into the activity or the sport may still be feeling some of these fears. The third one, fear of being judged for spending time exercising, and put whatever kind of exercise you want in there, instead of prioritizing their children, their family, or their work. And so these can be very powerful drivers as to why we don't see more women participating. We are going to use this, what came of this research by Sport England. A little later in the workshop, they did a campaign called This Girl Can, and I'm going to share with you some of the highlights with respect to that. So that's kind of a bit of a backdrop to the gender equity issue. Let me just pause here and I'll ask Claire if you wanted to add anything at this point, or if anyone has any comments or questions with respect to the topic of gender equity.
Nancy, you're covering everything to date, so I'm good.
Okay, thanks, Claire. No, we're good. All right. So let me take you into this evaluation overview. And I'm going to reference some of the information in that handbook that you received. So if you have the ability to put that in front of you, that it probably would be helpful to be able to see it in a little more detail than what is on the screen here. This is a very common approach to evaluation. Sometimes the words change a little bit, but they're pretty solid in terms of the process. So looking first of all at engaging stakeholders, we're going to take a deeper dive into that one. Making sure that you've got a good description of the program. And what we'll focus on today is the clarity of objectives as to what you're planning to do. It's difficult to evaluate if you haven't got a plan in place. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Focusing your evaluation design. So what will the methods look like that you might use to understand the situation and see if you're making any progress? We're going to focus in on outcomes as opposed to what you'll hear shortly as far as other types of evaluation go. Then it's about actually gathering the credible evidence that you need. And so the credibility lends itself to how and from whom you're collecting data as part of your evaluation. And by virtue of the fact that it's evidence, that usually means it's informing something or someone. And so you're using that evidence to justify some conclusions as to what we've learned. And some of those take a little broader look than just outcomes. And then the last step is to literally close the circle and look at being able to use and share the lessons that you've learned through that process. So these are the steps that are outlined in the workbook. The other piece that's there, and we're not going to spend very much time on it now, but there is a great deal of information in your workbook if you choose to go there. And it's this middle part here of the standards of evaluation. And so I'll just give you a brief kind of overview of each of those. And this is on page 7 in the workbook if you want to follow along there. The utility refers to the amount and type of information that you'll collect. Does it meet the needs of those who intend to use the findings? We're going to spend some time on that today. The feasibility identifies the question of, will the evaluation be practical, doable, and realistic? So obviously you need to allocate some resources to this, and do the resources that you have available for this match the kind of methodology that you'd like to entertain? So sometimes some prioritization is necessary. The proprietary or accuracy of what you're developing is, will the evaluation findings be correct? And the other interpretation of that is that can you sort of own them? Will they be yours to live with and work with as you move forward? And by that I mean that you trust and you have confidence in what you found. And the last one, in terms of being accurate, you want them to be as correct as possible. There is an appendix in your workbook on page 37. I won't go through these at this time, but I just wanted to point you to them, that looks at these 4 standards in much more detail. And it serves as a bit of a checklist as to how you might assess your readiness to take on an evaluation. So with that overview in mind, I wanted to get in a little bit more detail into how you might look at this at different levels within your organization. And so listed here, you might start at a very strategic or full organizational level. If you were undergoing a strategic plan or a recreation plan, the official plan for your municipality, any of those kinds of big picture, all encompassing sorts of roles, there's usually an evaluation component to those that does a bit of a look back and a look ahead. So what what have we done in the past since the last time you did it, 3 years, 5 years ago, whatever it might have been, and what do we anticipate for the future as far as the kinds of metrics or measurement that will go into monitoring how you're doing over this next term, another 5 years, for example. So it could be at that level within the organization. Where you also see it attached evaluation as that more of a programmatic kind of level, where it might be specific to an individual program or a group of programs. Perhaps they're all the issue or all the programs that you and services that you offer for women, girls, and gender diverse people. And so you might want to evaluate those as a cluster of initiatives. Or it may be one specific piece that you want to look at in terms of the evaluation, like one particular program. The words that often get attached to this, and they do differ by who's using them sometimes, but these are pretty standard as far as within that overall plan, whether it's for the strategy overall or an individual program, you often see goals, objectives, and then activities. Just to give you some examples here, a goal is usually a broad statement that gives you direction on something, where to achieve gender equity in our programs and services might be the goal. Whereas the objective is where the specificity comes in, and we'll spend a bit of time on this a little later. So an example would be to increase the percentage of women, girls, and gender diverse people participating in our programs over the next 3 years. Ideally, you'd even be able to attach a specific percentage to that if you had some baseline information to go from, or a pretty good guesstimate as to what your target would be. And then the activity breaks down into, well, how are we going to do that? What are the things that we're going to offer or do in order to reach that objective? And in the next 12 months, establish a gender equity policy for the department would be an example. So for every one goal, you would have at least one objective, and often many more than that. And for each objective, there may be a variety of different activities that are going to be necessary to meet that objective. So that's typically how a plan would connect with an evaluation. The next level to this, which is sort of the connector between the plan that you're developing and the evaluation of it, is what's called an indicator. And well, step 4 in the evaluation cycle that we'll talk about today deals specifically with indicators. I'm just interested, you can maybe give me a thumbs up on this or a thumbs down. Do these terms resonate with you as ones that you're familiar with or you use within your own organizations? I see a few there. Good. Are there alternatives that anyone would suggest that are different than this, that are more common in your practice? Don't see any suggestions coming forward. Okay, that's good. So you're seeing some consistency here then. Good. All right. So here's just a couple of evaluation definition, if you would, at the beginning. The systematic examination and assessment of features of an initiative and its effects in order to produce information that can be used by those who have an interest in its improvement or effectiveness. So that kind of describes the steps in that cycle. And this comes from the WHO, World Health Organization. I'm going to play for you here a little a video clip to just describe the difference between evaluation and research. So cross your fingers like this one works. Come on, here we go.
Both program evaluation and research have objectives that include answering questions, and both collect and analyze data using similar methods to answer those questions. However, there are distinct differences between program evaluation and research. We can start with the purpose of each. Program evaluation. Essentially, we can say that the purpose of a program evaluation is to collect information using rigorous methods. and use that information to make judgments and decisions about an instructional program. The information collected is usually analyzed, and recommendations for the instructional design are shared with stakeholders within and outside of the organization. When we complete a program evaluation, the things we do include measuring learners' reactions to the instruction and changes in their attitudes or performance when they are in a performance context. Now, research. Research is focused on proving a theory or a hypothesis. Researchers hope to increase the body of knowledge on a particular topic. Data that is collected and analyzed is therefore used for testing theories or hypotheses. Research is usually shared through presentations and published articles.
And then the last point I'd like to make here is
Dr. Dano Wanzer.
Oh, sorry. There you go.
Appreciate you joining me. Thank you very much. So I wanted to.
There we go. That you don't necessarily need a lot of evaluation expertise to plan and conduct an evaluation, but it's not uncommon that an external consultant, a third party, might be involved in either helping you to shape or actually undertake the evaluation. And that's sometimes because of a time factor in terms of the amount of time staff people might have to do this. It might be related to expertise or comfort level, or it might be related to objectivity. So sometimes if you're responsible for evaluating your own program, that can come with some bias to it, that particularly when you look at interpreting some results and that sort of thing. So there may be good reason to look at that third party kind of approach to this. I wanted to share with you one other video clip here. This is Erin Hamilton, and she is a recreation manager in the town of Aurora, north of Toronto here in Ontario. And she is responsible for a very specific initiative around gender equity. And so we had the opportunity to interview Erin, and this is a short clip that relates to particularly to the outcomes and the evaluation approach that they've taken there. With respect to progress on your initiative and the engagement of more women and girls into your programs and sports activities, I wonder, I know it's early days yet, but have you seen any increase so far or any change in the participation rates? And if so, is there anything that in particular that you might attribute that to?
Yeah, so I would say at this point, in terms of participation rates, we're not at that stage yet. Where we're seeing progress is working direct. So we're currently working with 3 pilot organizations. And so where we're seeing progress on that end is the sort of pieces that need to come first before we get to those significant changes of seeing increases in female coaches, officials, athletes. So we're seeing changes to board structures, changes to the way they promote out their programming. So really looking at their direction. So how we sort of are evaluating, looking at the impact is we're currently working. So now we have 3 organizations that are focusing on gender equity that we're not. We're expanding to 3 more organizations this fall. So it was our pilot. We've learned from it in terms of how we started to move through the process. And so we're expanding that, the number of organizations we're working with. So these ones will continue. They're looking at some new programming and initiatives in their upcoming season. So this is where we'll start to see hope to see some of the changes based on the learnings, where we're looking at some unique programs that they plan to implement in their upcoming season as a result of the research and the work that we've done so far. And then with a new sort of group of 3 organizations we'll work with, it's 3 more that we're not looking at gender equity specifically. So those are some of the success points and evaluation points that we're looking at in that initiative specifically. I would say as well, what's happened, so 2 initiatives related to coaches and leaders in the community is we did have our 20 female leaders in 2020, where we supported 20 females, coaches, officials, and board members to enhance and increase their certification and training specific to their role, or provide professional development training. And as a result of that, sort of an unknown benefit by doing that program is we built a number of relationships with these females, and they're now actually engaging in some of the initiatives that we're doing. So they're now becoming leaders in roles. So we're measuring that success where it wasn't just sort of the program happens, they go about doing it, that a number of them have engaged with us and are fulfilling new roles that they didn't before as a result of their training, or are a key part of sort of coming out and being a keynote speaker at some of the work and the projects we're doing that would not have existed before if we didn't do that program. So we have a few females that have stepped onto boards that were not on board positions before. So we are seeing some of those individuals as a result of the program step into roles or move up to the next stage of coaching or officiating that they weren't at before. So within that program, that's some of the measured success that we're seeing there. And then I would say the other is we have a women coaches circle. So we've collaborated with an organization called See What She Can Do, which is an online platform where they look to connect females in the community who want to be physically active together. We're going for a hike. Do you want to join us? Or there's this ball hockey league. Is anybody interested in participating? And through that partnership, we launched a women coaches circle where we're bringing female coaches together on a monthly basis in a virtual setting to talk about their experiences as female coaches. And so the hope is that through this, we're actually have our 8th one on Sunday evening, is that we're providing them with a space to learn and support one another in the hopes that by having somebody to talk to, they'll continue to play a role within sport. They're not going to leave sport because they have a sounding board, they have a network where they can reach out to. And so each session we talk about a different topic. So for us, as that group grows and expands, we see that as progress and success as we look to target to bring more coaches into the mix. And then it's coaches across multiple sports that would never have connected. So for us, we're evaluating and looking at, okay, how many people are part of this platform? What are the number of sports that are participating, and looking at the success that way and evaluating that in terms of success and being able to engage and increase the number of female coaches that are participating in the program.
You've identified a really key aspect of evaluation with what you've just described, in that it's not all about numbers. And by understanding sort of the diffusion of the effect of one individual, that by some initial investment, in this case in a professional development kind of direction, you get that 10 times back from the kinds of growth. And so there's a depth of participation that you've described that's not about the rate of participation. So thank you for that. What I wanted to bring you to next is some input from you. And so, MJ, I'm wondering if you can monitor the chat box in case anything comes through that way. But what I'm interested in is, what kinds of evaluations do you do now? What sorts of methods do you use, or what types of initiatives are you evaluating? Are there any that are either in the past that you've done them or currently underway now? You can type into the chat box any suggestions, or just pop in off mute. Nothing. Either you're shy or there really is nothing going on out there. I know it's many things are not evaluated. No examples? Okay, let's move on. This slide, it's very text heavy, but it's also in your workbook. And I wanted to just run down these evaluation types. I won't go into all of the details within this table, but I have spoken already about outcome evaluation. So I wanted to position it within other types of evaluation. So the first block here are formative evaluation. So where you're, while the program is still under development, you're looking at assessing how it's doing. So this might be where you do a pilot test of something. It would include things like a needs assessment of the population that you're trying to reach with a program. This is where you might go back to those standards to look at how evaluable is your program at this stage. And that's where those questions might come in handy. So these, as the word formative would suggest, it's as the program's forming, or it may be that as it's undergoing a rejuvenation of some kind. So you wanted to make some fairly major change to the initiative. And so we're gonna test out what we do as a trial run. The second type is process evaluation, and sometimes the term that more and more commonly I see attached to this is performance measurement. And so this is where you're looking at how you're doing the process that you're using. Is it efficient? Is it being delivered in the way that it was intended? And so this doesn't necessarily mean it's making any difference, that's changing anything, but you're evaluating how it's rolling out. So this begins as soon as the program itself begins, during operation of an existing program. So you're looking at how well it's working, the extent to which the program is being implemented as designed, and whether the program is accessible and acceptable to its target population. So this is the kind of thing where you often would do a satisfaction survey or something to gather people's feedback on how the program's going. You may want to know about the facilities, the instructor, the materials that are being provided, the pieces that are part of the program. Different yet again then from this outcome evaluation, which is what we're going to focus on today, where you're focused on whether or not your objectives have been met. So you're looking usually to monitor change, and it could be change in individuals and their behavior or their knowledge, perhaps even their skill level, if we're talking about sport in particular. So it could be at an individual level. It could be also at an organizational level. So one of the changes you might want to see, I gave you the example of this objective earlier, is whether or not a gender equity policy has been put in place. So the policies have actually changed. It may be about how decisions are made in an organization and by whom. So it doesn't always have to just be about individual change. And so with this one, you're often, the most part of this comes at the end of a program. However, often you'll see changes throughout a program. So particularly if people have registered for something that's let's say a 6-week or 12-week program, and they're going to see changes all along the way. Maybe after week 3 or 4, people are reporting some form of change, particular to what the program objectives are. So it's not a bad idea to monitor those along the way. Erin, when we heard her clip just from Aurora there, they do sort of a midpoint evaluation of their initiatives within gender equity, partly to check on the process, but also to capture those intermediate or earlier outcomes that have actually changed in people. Different yet again than the next one down here, economic evaluation, where lots of different terms come up. You can see them listed here. One that's not here that's very common is return on investment, looking at what the economic benefit or maybe loss in some cases has been as a result of your initiative. These ones are challenging to do without some real expertise around economic evaluation. An economist would be the kind of person that you'd look for to do these kind of things. Certainly you can do relatively simple analysis on what did it cost to run the program versus the revenue that you brought in as a result of it, but it doesn't always capture some of the softer costs or the the cost of the benefits attached to the gains of the program. The last one here is an impact evaluation. And this one is what you learn when you roll all of this together. And so when you think about overall, what was the impact of the program? And so you want to try and generate lessons learned kind of thing. I'm just reading a chat mention in here. Yeah, Ron's mentioned that it's often that program monitoring or the process evaluation, keeping track of those numbers, especially for those responsible for offering services or managing facilities. The other ones aren't nearly as common. I think I would certainly agree. And the outcome one, I think people are being pushed a little more to get to that level of what difference did we make as a result of the program. So when you're trying to make the case for whether it's in an individual program or your annual budget that you're taking forward to your municipal council to support the recreation and parks department as a whole, it's not just about how many people we served or how many programs we offered or how many new trails were built, but what difference did it make to people's lives? So granted, it is a much more challenging type of evaluation to undertake, which we're going to talk more about. I just want to add to this list a little bit with two kind of emerging types of evaluation that aren't necessarily in contrast to those ones that we just saw in the chart. One you saw is the economic kind of approach. So I won't go into that again, but the other is this developmental evaluation. And it's kind of a combination of the process and the formative. I've included a reference here by a fellow by the name of Michael Quinn Patton, and he's sort of the pioneer of this approach. And it's probably been around for maybe 10 years or so, people using it off and on. It's very effective or very helpful if you've got a program that you're offering that's new and you're really wanting to learn from it as quickly as possible, but without having to necessarily wait till the end of the program when it's done. And so the developmental kind of nature of it is that the program actually may alter as you go along. So you're doing mid-course correction to look at what's working well, what's not working well, what did we expect to see that maybe we are or we aren't at this stage, and so what kind of changes do we need to make? So it requires a sort of a close eye on certain things, and those certain things are these indicators that tell you, well, what is it that we want to listen to or pay attention to, so that the initiative would change as it goes along.
Nancy?
Yes.
We have a comment in the chat from Ram Smith. And he said, in my experience, program monitoring in recreation or sports sector is the default, especially for those responsible for offering services, I assume, or managing facilities. The other types of evaluation are much less common. Often it is a lack of resources or expertise.
Right. Okay. Thank you. We spoke briefly to that, I think. Yeah. Okay. This I want to point you to this reference before I go into this type of additional type of evaluation. I'm not sure if any of you are already familiar with this. It's called the Community Toolbox, and it's a service operated out of the University of Kansas, and it is an absolute wealth of information on such a wide range of topics, evaluation being one of them, planning, engagement strategies, community development. It's got all kinds of chapters within this toolkit. It also offers examples and resources attached to it. It's because it's operated through the university, there are also students who are attached to questions that people pose, and they'll do some digging around for you to find results, whether it's advice that you're looking for or more examples of whatever it is. It's just a wealth of information. So the information I'm going to share here, I did take from, and the URL is here as communitytoolbox.ku.edu. So this approach to evaluation is called participatory, and the essence of this is that the people that you're evaluating are actually part of developing gathering and analyzing the data, the information. And so they're participants, and they're participants in the evaluation. I see this often used with youth in particular. So they're developing the questions. They're identifying, where are we going to reach the people we need to ask these questions of? What platform are people paying attention to these days? The app that folks are using, is it Facebook? Is it TikTok? What are the up and coming pieces that you're looking for? And so they help with the language, they help with the tone, they sort of set the culture of the evaluation. And so when we talk about women, girls, and gender diverse people, this would be an example of where engaging the groups that you're trying to reach right from the outset, not only in terms of helping to plan the program, which is what Claire talks about in the next workshop that we're doing on community engagement, of how to get to those people in your neighborhoods and communities, but also then to engage them in the evaluation. Sometimes it means building some capacity in those folks. I worked on a project at one point where there was funding available within the initiative to hire an evaluator. And we decided there were 5 different pilot communities on this project. And we were in favor of building the capacity of people within our own community, and having that be the essence of the evaluator rather than hiring a professional. And it worked out really well. So not all of them, but many of them brought those skills to other things that they were doing, whether it was work in an organization or things that they did at school. And so we evaluated the evaluation at the end of the day. Just going to check here again. Lindsay's asking for the link in the chat. Is it the link to the toolbox, Lindsay, that you're looking for? Okay, I'll just type it in here real quick.
Nancy, I can put it in there so you can carry on.
Okay, all right, I won't worry about that. Thank you. Okay, so let's move on to sort of how these might integrate together across a bit of a timeline. Certainly the things like a participatory evaluation, it could happen anytime, and it would happen throughout whatever you were doing. It's more of an approach to how you do the others. So as I mentioned earlier, the formative evaluation is usually during that program development phase. Then you move into when you're actually delivering on whatever the program is, so that you've got a process evaluation in place. The outcome may start within a very short time. You might start to see some of those changes at program implementation. And then certainly, probably more commonly, you see it at the end. And then this impact, or sometimes you hear the word summative evaluation attached to this, where it's that summation of, or a summary of all of what you've learned on a particular program. So this may help to sort of plan out your approach to evaluation as we go through. Okay. I wanted to just share with you some of the learnings to date with respect to evaluating gender equity in recreational sports. So these are some of the learnings that the Canadian Women in Sport and Sport Organization has identified. And I won't go into the details, but there is a document linked here that gives you a bit of a snapshot of these. So I'll give you a quick look at that. So from one of the things that CWS does is, and some of you may have been involved in this, where they do sort of a deeper consultation with a community or with an organization to really look at their policies, practices, procedures, and programs with respect to gender equity lens. And so when they have looked at the results of those kinds of relationships with municipalities or organizations, it will take some time to be able to directly attribute positive results back to the key intervention or program. And sometimes you're not even ever able to do that. It's something called causality, and it's very difficult sometimes without a real sort of scientifically rigorous approach to evaluation, like what you might hear called a randomized control trial, which we're not in the business of doing. That's much more on that research end of the spectrum that you heard spoken about earlier. The notion here is that, can you actually say that the change that you saw was a direct result of the initiative that you did? And it's very difficult to make that connection in 2 ways. One is, was it the sole factor in causing that change. It may have been a contributing factor, but not necessarily the sole factor. And then because you don't have a comparison to it, so here we did the program and here we didn't, and you're measuring the results in both cases, there may be other sort of confounding variables that have entered into the picture that you really weren't even tracking or monitoring through the process. So two key messages here. One is it does take time, and it may actually not even be possible. So that's where this feasibility of an evaluation comes in as to whether or not we can undertake the kind of evaluation that's necessary to measure the sorts of changes that we would like to see. Some of the progress, however, that they have seen in these organizations are listed here in these 5 bullets. Organizations have developed committees that address equity, diversity, and inclusion. So some sort of governing body, perhaps, depending on the roles and responsibilities of that committee. At the very least, they're paying attention to it. They're probably making recommendations or monitoring the status of things within an organization. And from my experience, these are becoming more and more common as the whole EDI world has just sort of blown up in terms of the attention that this is receiving for many different reasons. And so certainly women, girls, and diverse gender people are going to fit into those categories. In some of our other workshops, we talk about intersectionality and how the roles of not all girls and women are the same. So even thinking about them as one group, they intersect with many other aspects of their life. And so hopefully these committees are looking at the depth and the breadth of those the populations. Organizations have hired point people for gender equity work. I know of one municipality who actually had to go to the Human Rights Commission of Canada to offer up in their job description that they would only hire an Indigenous staff person for this role. And it was actually in another instance in the same municipality. It was only the job was only available to females. So we're getting closer, but it still takes some work to even get those kinds of statements out there. Terms of references have been developed for the above work. So whether it's people's jobs or these committees, so they're getting some structure to what they're doing. Organizations are developing gender equity visions and strategies, sometimes follow up to a policy as a first start to it. And then lastly, Canadian Women in Sport is consulting on more projects, including reviewing equity policies and revisions to job postings to be more inclusive. So these are all examples of outcomes. They're things that changed, and they're making progress towards the broader goal. I will just open up this document and give you a quick look at this snapshot so that you can see the kind of information that's available through it. I just need to, sorry, move. I'm just going to do a quick shift here. Sorry, one moment. Here. So this is a kind of like an infographic look to the current status. And so this is a snapshot across Canada looking at gender equity. And so this was from 2021. You've got, I won't go into all the numbers, but board representation, whether it be at membership level or leadership level, and the number of women on boards, it goes down into, there's 3 pages here, staff representation, with respect to direct reports and staff leaderships. And then the percentage of organizations where women hold over half of the positions within the organization. And then thirdly, looking at some of the diversity within sport organizations beyond gender. So we're looking at whether they collected data on self-identified racial identities. So some of that intersectionality starts to come out with this. So this is available on the Canadian Women in Sport website. And again, some of these numbers may be helpful to you with your data that you're looking for to make that case if that's where you're at. So I'll just bring us back. Okay. So moving now specifically to this area of outcomes, speaking about with a sort of a definition in mind, outcomes are benefits or changes for individuals for populations during or after participating in program activities. They're influenced by outputs, and some of the outcome, well, I'll come back to that outputs in a moment. Outcomes may relate to changes in behavior, skills, knowledge, attitudes, values, conditions, status, or other attributes. They're what participants know, think, or can do, how they behave, or what their condition is that's different following the program. This is another, and MJ, maybe you could put this into the chat box as well, this link to the United Way of America. They have a whole initiative around measuring program outcomes. And so that's where this definition has come from. I'm just going to take a look at the chat. There's a question about a break. Yes, I was planning on a break about halfway through, which will be about 1:30. And so we'll take about a 10-minute break at that stage. Thanks for the question. Okay. All right. Outcome measures. So this reinforces a little bit of the what you're actually trying to get a handle on. What are you trying to measure? These are just examples, but you could be looking at changes in programs. And so an example of that might be more programs and associated space for girls, women, and gender diverse people are available in prime time operating hours. So that's an outcome. That's a change. The schedule changes and the placement of where those activities are taking place could change. It could be a change in policy. You saw the example of a gender equity policy being put in place, the kind of work that Erin's doing in Aurora, where it's a whole multifaceted initiative, also gives that, that impression. Sorry, I've lost you guys. I just have to bring my screen back up. Okay. And then the third one, changes in practices. So this might look at program planning and delivery for girls, women, and gender diverse people is coordinated with other community service delivery agencies. So not every organization has to offer every program. The YMCA might offer program X and the municipality program Y, or offering it at different times. And so there's a coordination that perhaps didn't happen before. That's a change that could be measured. Another example in that one, women, girls, and gender diverse people feel more welcome in the facility as a result of improved customer service training. So these are other examples of the kinds of changes that you might watch for or plan for. This speaks to the budget, the dollars and cents that may be necessary with or that is necessary if you're going to undertake some form of evaluation. And this would include actual dollars. It might include resources such as staff, those sorts of things. And so guideline as to how much you might want to think about setting aside on this. There's two different kind of guidelines out there. One comes from the World Health Organization, and their recommendation is that between 3 and 5% of the overall budget for the initiative, for the program, should be allocated to evaluation. That percentage goes up a little bit when you look at the recommendation from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention in the US. They require, for instance, if they're doing a granting program or that sort of thing, that allocation to evaluation rise to 10%. So somewhere in that neck of the woods is ideal. As I said earlier, and as Ron mentioned in his comment, the more expensive or the more intense types of evaluation may actually not often are those resources allocated to that kind of an evaluation. Okay, what I wanted to take us into now is the first of these steps with respect to the cycle of evaluation. Bear with me for just a second. I need to do one thing here with my video. There we go. So we're going to look at the first 3 or 4 of these steps today, because you can't really do the other pieces until you've got some data to work with, but they are covered off in your workbook when you're ready to address that. So if we look at the first one here, we already mentioned these 4 standards. So these are the more detailed to the ones that were in the center of that wheel. So I'll skip over this piece and look at the first step of engaging stakeholders. So this is taken from page 10 and 11 in your workbook as potential sectors to think about. And obviously these would be relative to the community that you're in the first place as to whether or not these even exist, the scope of the program that, have you partnered with any of these types of sectors within the program? Is it even relevant to them? So the idea here is you'd pick and choose between these, but these are just some examples of the kinds of stakeholders that you might work with. We're going to play with some of these in the mural board in a few minutes to see what your feeling is with respect to a particular program. A stakeholder is sort of defined as someone who has something to gain or lose as a result of the initiative. So they may not be directly involved in the delivery of a program, but is it going to affect them in some way, the results or the delivery of what you're working on? And again, it's in not only that intentional way, but maybe it's more of an unintended outcome that you might be thinking about potential stakeholders. I want to share with you a resource or a tool that you may find helpful when you're thinking about stakeholders. I use this all the time in whether it's a planning or an evaluation context, and it's often called a stakeholder wheel. And I'll just explain there's sort of 2 different features to it. The first are these concentric circles that are labeled with a description of the type of involvement or the type of participation that you're expecting. So you've got people that would make up a core of a committee, maybe a steering committee on something, or it's 3 or 4 people who are responsible for that program. And they've got some accountability for it. They manage a budget, perhaps they're making decisions about the program or the initiative. And so they tend to be fairly heavily involved and over a fairly long period of time. What I see a lot of is many limit the participation to just that method or just that level. They have a committee, and that committee is expected to do everything. And often it's either too much work or you didn't have the exact expertise you're looking for. So that's why I like to use these other layers as very specific tasks or jobs that you might be looking for. So people who are at the involved level are involved in some way with your, in this case, I'll tie it to directly to an evaluation, but they may not sit, or they don't sit on your core committee. They're not coming to meetings all the time. So this might be an example of this would be someone who you've engaged the services of with respect to technology, perhaps. So you want to do some kind of survey, and no one around that core table is really very familiar with a survey platform like SurveyMonkey or whatever it might be. So you might need to reach out to somebody from a different department within your organization or an expert in the community. You may have to pay someone to do that so that there's a direct task for which they're going to be involved. And that's the only expectation that they would do that. The supportive ring are people who are not even yet involved. They may never be really very involved, but they need to support what you're doing. So these might be the managers or directors or board members in an organization who are approving the budget for a program that includes some evaluation. Or maybe someone has to approve the questions that are going to be asked in a survey. Or perhaps we talked about one of the objectives earlier that involves some customer service training to help hopefully make people, particularly women and girls, more comfortable in the environment. So that's the kind of support that you may be looking for. The informed level are those that may not really need to or don't support what you do, but they need to know about it. They need to be informed that it's going on. So different ways for people to become engaged in what you're doing. To overlay this are the dotted lines that make it look a little bit like a pizza to divide this. And this is just arbitrary. It happens to have five slices, but you could put as many as you wanted in. And this relates back to this list of sectors that I shared with you earlier, where each of these, and this is what the broken line on the outside is to write on what sector you're working with, or what, in the case of a, let's use a municipal recreation department, you might be bringing somebody in from the parks crew. You might be needing to bring somebody in from planning, the planning department. You might need to be working with someone in transportation. So it could be different departments within your organization. That's really to bring a variety of perspectives to what you're talking to. So the idea of using this tool is that you'd actually write people's names. So in this core, from this department, which was the parks crews, we're going to put Tom's name in here. Over here, somebody from transportation, we're going to put Jane in here. And there would be other names at other levels. As an evaluation support, you might want to look at, over time, the course of the program or the initiative, have people who were only informed become more involved. So you can do a comparative look at this kind of layout at the beginning compared to beginning, middle, or end of a program. Just interested if anybody has any history of working with this kind of tool. Any comments or questions from anyone on it? It's pretty straightforward. Nope. Okay. So let's come to our stakeholders. We're looking now at trying the step one of engaging those stakeholders. So once you've identified who you'd like to have around that table, around the program, there may be some questions that are helpful to ask about their perspective on the evaluation. So what's important about this program? Who do you represent, and why are you interested in the program? What would you like this program to accomplish? You're starting to get at those outcomes. What are the critical evaluation questions? What do you want to know as a result of this evaluation? How will you use the results? And what resources of a variety of different types can you contribute to this evaluation? So you're trying to do a bit of an assessment and a compilation of what the stakeholders who you've identified, who are they, and what do they want to know as a result of the evaluation of this particular program. So we're going to take a few minutes now. I think let's do this after a break. So it's 1:20 now in our time zone. So check your clocks wherever you are. We'll take a 10-minute break. And when we come back, MJ is going to take us back into a mural activity that's going to look at this stakeholder engagement aspect. Okay. So take 10, and I'll see you back in a few. Okay, welcome back. It's hard to tell who's back and who's not, but let's get going. Okay, just before I turn things over to you, and I'll explain this task. There's a question in the chat box. Excuse me, is data on women in sport national? Who is collecting it? Is similar data available for women in sport with, for example, sport participation? Yes, and from a variety of, I would say from two key sources I would point you to. One is the Canadian Fitness and Lifestyle Research Institute, CFLRI. They have just actually revamped their website and made it much easier to find data on different populations, but they also do setting-based research in workplaces, in schools, and it's all around sport, physical activity, and recreation. They're just launching a new series of surveys in the next little while. The most recent one will be with governments in different sectors of government across the country. The other source I'd point you to, and MJ's put it's just cflri.ca as their website. Thank you. And the other one would be Canadian Women in Sports. So like that infographic that I shared with you, the snapshot, that's the kind of information that they would be collecting. And for the most part, it is national in scope. But I think CFLRI does break down data at the provincial and territorial level. I'm not sure that CWS does that breakdown as well. So hopefully that gets you started with a couple there. Okay, I'll take you back to my slides here to get us into an exercise on the stakeholder engagement. and it's going to be using our mural board. So I'll first of all describe the activity and then have MJ take us into that. So I have case study prepared, and there's someone on the call today, and I'm glad we asked that question about where you're from. And I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit. It's Derek Linwood. And Derek, I'm wondering if you could tell me if you have any connection to the Van Play initiative in Vancouver. Are you still on here? Yeah, there's Derek.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
My video doesn't be going. That would be because the little cover is on it.
Oh, there you are.
Well, hello. So I do not have any credit on the document. I was not involved in the preparation of it. Predates my time, just shy of when I started with the city when they started that initiative. But my current portfolio is the citywide sports services coordinator. It's a revamped position after somebody retired in 2020. So my position was kind of born out of that document really, and addressing certain initiatives within it. So amazing document. If you haven't seen it, it was a very thorough undertaking of kind of, where are we at? They did four documents outlining, what are the assets that we do have within the city of Vancouver. It's called the inventory analysis. They then took that and they said, okay, what's our big 25 goals for the next, I believe, 25 years. And then they kind of broke it down further into 10 or 25 objectives and 10 goals to shape the next 25 years. And then kind of broke that down further into what are some actual actionable goals that we can take. And the idea is that we are going to frame every single thing that the park board undertakes in the lifespan of Van Play should funnel back to something that is an objective of Van Play. So specifically, let's see if I can remember them off the top of my head. My portfolio was brought in to address the High Five initiative that we were trying to undertake to value youth sport and proper childhood development. If you know anything about our system as well, it can be difficult to have a little bit of continuity across our system because each center runs independently and in joint operation with its own community center association nonprofit. So kind of prioritizing youth sport in that sense, providing opportunities for individuals at any age and across the long-term development spectrum. So I will be hiring somebody actually within the next 2 months to start undertaking that initiative and saying, hey, who are we missing within this long-term development gap from Sport for Life, Canadian Sport for Life, who's not represented, right? Like, who is it individuals trying to play sport that have never played and they're more advanced in age, or is it the folks that are trying to maintain their sport initiatives? But the whole thing, I don't know if I'm rambling too much here, but the whole thing is to say, hey, why are we doing any single thing that we're doing? And it should be kind of coming back to this very, very thorough evaluation that was undertaken of what we currently do and to try to rescope our efforts in decolonization and equity and inclusiveness and all these major points.
Great. Thank you so much for that, because what I'm going to share with you, with everybody, is using that as the case study that we're going to look through. So I'd be happy for you to jump in at any point with either more clarification or the actual decisions and such that have been made. Yeah. So that'd be very helpful. Thank you. So I'll share with you a little bit about that in just a moment. The activity, what we're going to ask you to do on Mural is, like you wrote your location on those stickies, in this case, instead of the location, I'm going to ask you to identify for Van Play who you think some of the stakeholders might be that would be interested in the evaluation of this particular initiative. And just to kind of direct your thinking, they could be people or organizations that are involved at the operational level. So in the sort of service delivery aspect, they could be partners if there's some sort of co-leadership or co-delivery model. And these obviously is going to be a bit hypothetical. It's more getting a chance to think it through. Those served or affected by the initiative, who might those stakeholders be, and the decision makers for the initiative. So we're just going to generate these on stickies, one idea per sticky, and there's a place to put them under these 4 headings within, and then we'll come back and do the second part in a moment. So just to give you my gleaning of the initiative in Van Play, and certainly Derek can add to this. But it started in 2018 and it began with a survey of these 10 goals to shape the next 25 years. And 92% of the people surveyed responded and supported the goal of prioritizing the delivery of resources where they are needed most. So a real look at the sort of equity aspect in the city. So one of the top 3 priorities identified was equity, inclusion, and access. They were identified by the community in phase 1 of the engagement. Van Play Tour participants were enthusiastic for the park board to address the equitable delivery of facilities across the city. There's an external advisory group and a staff working group in place. And then, as Derek mentioned, there's been these 3 sort of phases of work. First of all, identifying these service gaps, which were known as initiative zones, addressing inequity by applying an intersectoral lens as we work to fill these gaps in an inclusive way that meets the needs of the community. And then thirdly, the connectivity phase presents a vision for a network of parks, green spaces, and recreation areas interwoven into everyday life that connects us to nature, to each other, and to ourselves. So with that as kind of a backdrop, I'll put this back here just so you've got it. I'll have to take it down for MJ to take us to the mural, but she's going to take us in there, and this step 1 is what I'm going to ask of you. I think we could probably, since we're all going to be writing on these stickies at the same time, likely about 10 minutes will be plenty, and in fact I may call you as short as about 8 minutes to do this. Okay, so MJ, over to you. Okay, finish up the thought that you're on now, if you would, if there's any sort of in play, and then we'll have a quick look at this. Okay, so let's look at the top left being who's involved in the program operations. Derek, if you maybe give us a little bit of insight, are there ones here that are missing, key ones in terms of who operates the initiative?
Yeah, so Derek, city programmers, Healy's Parks and Rec Department, New Hire, Fourth Life, Vancouver Park Board. Yeah, so I mean, in terms of the actual operation, what this is typically going to be is those community level positions within the city, like our programmers, our recreation programmers, and they are going to be operating based on the policies that may have been instituted by their supervisors and their managers, and folks like myself who are, you know, taking the Van Play document, making that decision and implementing it. And then on the actual operational side, so you would have the managers and the supervisors and the policy makers within the city. You'd have the city programmers who are enacting that at their individual community centers and sites around town. And then you would have, I mean, the intricacy, if we wanted to get into like the whole divisions within the city, because our park board operates as a part of the city, but actually is its own entity, its own elected body. So then there's all the intricacies of different departments within the city that we then work with that would be enacting some of those operations as well.
Good.
But that's getting nitpicky.
Okay. Okay, so we've got a good cross section here, it looks like. And then you can see from the pink ones in the top right, who some of the partners are within the community and also within the province, like Sport BC, sports associations. Mentioned in the case study description of an advisory group as well as a staff working group. So there's likely partners around those tables. If we scroll down to the bottom row, who is served or affected by the program. So we've got the people who are in those high need or higher need community areas. They may be equity seeking groups, park users, immigrants, all individuals accessing the facilities and programs. Okay. And then over under the last one about the decision makers. So we've got some, we talked about Donnie already, the city itself of Vancouver, local government. So those are pretty much maybe the same thing. So the purpose of doing this is to identify, it doesn't really matter what quadrant people end up in it. Those are just ways to kind of organize your thinking around this, but is to generate really through perhaps a start as a brainstorm, but then to really narrow it down to who are these stakeholders that we're wanting to work with. So thank you for your input to that. We're going to come back to this again and when we do the next step. So I'll just pop you into the slides right now to share the next little part of this, and we're going to come back to it right away. Just a minute. I gotta.
The one group that I will add, I would say to those affected and actually as a partner and then actually helping in the decision making would just be advocacy groups, because the whole idea of this project is to hear from the individuals that maybe historically have not been heard from, right? Who's not at the table. So if you are an individual that is on your own or you're part of a group of people, whether it's actually an established nonprofit or just a group of friends or whatever the case may be, and you're advocating for a sport, a group of individuals, a need for resources in a certain part of town, no matter how you get there, if you are advocating within the system, you are then going to become a partner and a stakeholder in the decision-making process, and you're involved in the entire kind of feedback loop and the path forward. So the chart that we just made got a lot of those folks internal to the organization, and then those who would be affected by the program, but actually folks outside of the organization are integral as partners.
That would be a great example of if you were taking a participatory evaluation approach, that we wouldn't necessarily be all of them, but those would be potential people to be involved with a participatory approach to evaluation. That's great. Okay, so we're going to add a step 2 to this. And so following along in this workbook process, it's now trying to kind of narrow in on 2 subgroups of those stakeholders. And these are specifically related to 2 questions around evaluation. So the first one down here under step 2 on the bottom of this slide are which people on those stickies that we just identified will use the results of the evaluation in some way. So you'll see when we go back in there, there's a whole pile of these little magnifying glasses that you can click and drag. And so I'm asking you if you would, when we go back into there, is to take the magnifying glass and drag it onto any of those stickies, doesn't matter what color, what quadrant they're in, that you think are going to be using the results of the evaluation. The second question is around who will be involved in most evaluation decisions. So that might include things like any type of budget or resourcing that's attached to it. They may be in an approval role before materials can go out, but they need to be involved because of their role in decision making with respect to evaluation. And for that, the icon is the little justice scale to use, because they're weighing the pros and cons and making decisions. Okay, so let me take this down, and MJ, if you could take us back, or people could go back into their mural, and you'll see off to the left-hand side of the purple boxes, there's all your little people to move. And so just wherever you want to click and drag who you think, first of all, might be wanting to use the results. That's the magnifying glass. And the scale are the people who make decisions. Okay. Thank you for that. We're going to build on this one more time, not right away, but in a subsequent step. So what we've got here are some that are specific to one of the two questions, and some that are that have links to both of them. So MJ is going to work her magic in the background here, and we'll come back to this, and it'll look a little bit different, but the same information will be there when we come back to look at it again. Okay, I need to go back here. Okay, we'll look at that. As I said, we'll look at that again. This was just more information from the Van Play program. So that comes from the report and the website that MJ shared with you if you're looking for more on this. Okay, so now we're into step 2. So the first one is looking at those, who are we going to involve, and what are they, what's their perspective on the evaluation. This next part gets into 3 components with respect to describing the program. And so before we can evaluate it, we need to be clear, what is it about? So one of them is the stage of development that the program is in, the statement of the problem, and then thirdly, some form of a depiction of this. And the one that's recommended here, and that certainly I use an awful lot, is a logic model, which I'll share with you a little bit about what that is. So the stage is really being clear where you're at in the program delivery. So that timeline that I shared with you earlier, are you looking at a formative evaluation in the early days? Are you into the implementation phase, meaning you've got some options there of looking at any or all of these types of an evaluation? Or is the program in a maintenance phase where you know it's working fairly well, you know you're getting the kinds of outcomes you're interested in, and so it's just more of a ongoing improvements that you might be interested in, which are usually process related things. With respect to the description of evaluability, to know that a program is ready to be evaluated so that you've got enough detail to move forward with an evaluation, these are the kinds of things that need to be in place before you're ready to jump off. Define goals and objectives, clearly specified success indicators and outcomes, some clearly defined audiences so you know who the participants clearly are or will be. Well-defined activities that are implemented in some sort of prescribed manner. So you've got an order to things. These plausible causal linkages, which I spoke to earlier, and I'll show you another piece in the logic model, between the activities and the outcomes, and then some form of organizational structure that can support the collection of information. And so that might be technology-based, it may be sort of data entry of information, it may be expertise that's needed. So you need to know that you've got the resources to fall back on. So if you can sort of check these off, you're pretty good to go with respect to taking on that evaluation step. The second of them, of those requirements in describing the program, is a statement of the problem. So why are you offering this initiative? What is it hoping to accomplish? And often this has to do, in the realm that we're talking about, is participation, and whether that's depth of participation or breadth of it, and in particular, the number of women, girls, and gender diverse people that are engaged in the programs. So here's just some examples of how you might respond to these 3 questions. Girls, women, and gender diverse people participate in recreational sport at much lower rates than males. So that's the problem we're trying to address. What's the magnitude of the problem? This starts to get you a baseline as to where you're starting from with the numbers and the change that you're looking for. So these are, I just pulled these stats from what we talked about earlier. In terms of the current participation rates. And then thirdly, you're wanting to take a closer look at sort of the root of the problem. What causes the problem? And this is where you might come into play with that fear factor that Lisa in Sport England speaks to with respect to that fear of judgment. That could be very much a part of the cause of the problem. In this case, the example I've listed here, girls, women, and gender diverse people are not consulted in program development, nor are they part of the decision-making process. So you saw that infographic from CWS where it outlines the number of women who are increasingly in positions of leadership and decision making. They also do not see themselves represented in leadership roles such as coaches or board members. So those could be contributing factors to the problem. There could be a whole host of those. So that's sort of step one in the it's the first part of step two of looking at being clearly able to describe the problem. What I wanted to do is just give you a brief glimpse into logic models. Some of you may be very familiar with these already, and it's a study in and of itself. So I'll give you the tip of the iceberg view of it, and certainly can encourage you to look more into it if it's something that you're not familiar with or you wanted to make use of in more detail. A logic model is really a way to tell a story, and the story is one of logic. That is the idea that if we do this, then this will happen. And that's that causal linkage, that there's some confidence that you have that we know what we should be doing. We have the resources to do it with, and here's what we anticipate will happen as a result of it. Generally, almost always, you want to have them on one page. So you need to be quite concise in what you're describing. It can be in a lot of different shapes, can go top to bottom, it can go bottom to top, left to right. Sometimes I've seen them even done in a circle. So there's no prescription as to how they have to look. It does help, I think, a lot with communications of what the program actually is when you can succinctly share it from start to finish on one page. It represents the specifics of the underlying, more and more you hear this notion of a theory of change. That's sort of the big picture of what are we really doing this for, or what approach are we taking? So gender equity would be an example of a theory of change, that if we're going to accomplish this Sport Canada or Government of Canada goal by 2035 of equity in sport at all levels, then that's the theory of change, is that there are things we can be doing that will accomplish that broader goal. So I'll give you just a couple of examples. This is where the causality isn't necessarily shining, where you've got this complex problem, but what really is the answer to the problem isn't very clearly defined. I think you should be more specific in this step. We can't count on miracles. So these are typically the elements in a logic model. And I'm wondering, MJ, if you could copy this link into the chat as well for there's a whole workbook on logic models if you're interested in more information on this. Comes from the Public Health Ontario. I'll show you this visually, but these are the pieces that go into making up a logic model typically. I'm going to show you a couple of examples just to give you an idea. So this would be an example of a plan. This is very generic, where we've got inputs. So what are we investing? What's the stuff that we need to operate this program? The outputs are the things that happen in and of itself with the program. So it's often a combination of what happened. So it might be a certain number of sessions that were held, training that was provided, partners that you're working with. It's the process kinds of things that you would track, and a combination with who you're reaching. And so these are not only the who, but sometimes tied into this is the satisfaction of those individuals with the program. So this is what you can count these kinds of things. Then we get into the outcomes. And so looking at usually either a short, medium, and long term, or maybe just short and long, depending on how long the actual program is. But what you're looking for here, and these are just suggestions, it's like a buffet of changes that could happen. In the short term, more cognitive kinds of things. In the medium term, more action or behavioral sorts of changes. And usually in the longer term, like we heard from CWS, takes longer to actually affect the conditions or the systems in which we're working. Around the logic model, we have information that's helpful from a context perspective. So often at the beginning, if you were planning something, you'd identify undertaking some form of situational assessment. What's going on in the environment around us? there may be some priorities that you're needing to address. So in the example from Van Play, they've got the 10 goals in 25 years. So those priorities have been established. That's the situation you're working within. So the plan should reflect that. Under here, we've got some assumptions that maybe you're working under. And so some of that may have to do with a limited budget that you have available, that you're not going to be working with any third-party consultants or experts in the field. External factors are things you just can't change. They're out there. They may affect what you're doing, but you can't, they're not within your purview to make change within. So this is just a depiction of what it can look like. When we layer that with evaluation, you'll see across along the bottom, these are just the categories from the previous slide. Here are where often the types of evaluation overlay what we've got with the elements of the logic model. So the formative kinds of evaluation at the beginning to understand the situation and priorities, the process evaluation around these outputs, the outcomes that are along the line, and this one I would say might even actually extend a little bit more broadly into the process one, and then this impact, which is usually at the end in a longer time period. So I won't read all the questions there, but you can see the kinds of things consistent with what we talked about before. Okay. And then this last one, you're not going to be able to read the details. It's in your workbook on page 18. And this is just an example that actually has the information in here. It's not just categories and things. And it's specific to physical activity. And you can see here the statement of the problem is that 85% of adults and 45% of youth do not achieve the recommended amount of moderate physical activity. What I wanted to highlight in this example are the arrows. In the previous ones, it's sort of very linear, when in fact these arrows explain the logic and it gets messier, where this particular initial outcome of an increase in choices available for recreation or transportation, such as new paths, classes, or flex time, that's going to have a direct effect. If we see that increase, then we will see an increased level of regular physical activity for adults. We'll see an increased access to physical activity, and we'll see an increase in the number or the percentage of people who walk or bicycle for transportation. And when you see multiple arrows like that, that means that's a highly impactful outcome, where it's going to have several different relationships to other things. So let me pause here. And I just wanted to let you ask if you have any questions, or anyone might have any comment on the concept of logic models. I hope I haven't thrown too much at you all at once here.
Hi there. I just have one question here. Just looking at the logic model, the example you provided here. What can you explain the difference between activities and initial outcomes? The example you gave, increased choices available for recreation, etc., almost seems like an activity that would result in some of those immediate outcomes. So what's the difference, and how do you know where to put it in the logic model?
I'll answer that in two ways. The first way is the logic model is often the tool that you'd use towards the end of a process. So it's where you put stuff after you've made some decisions. It's sometimes difficult to actually complete the logic model as you go along, but rather getting the information that would fill in these boxes, and then the last step is actually putting them in the boxes. To answer your question about the differences between, the activities are what you do. So you can see that here they're developing a coalition. They've got physicians who are going to counsel patients. We're going to implement a worksite challenge. So these are the things that you do. These would represent things in a work plan or an op plan, those kinds of things. As opposed to the initial outcomes are the changes that you're starting to see. So here, so you develop a coalition. Well, so what? Well, we've got a work plan now. A group of people have attached a work plan. We didn't have that before. The patient's progress along stages of readiness for physical activity. The individual is starting to see some change already. And then the one I shared earlier about increasing the choices available. So these outcomes are really trying to describe the change as a result of these activities. Does that help?
Yes, thanks for that. It almost, there's almost I think it's really important where you come into the process and what your actions are, because I could see developing a logic model where one of the activities could be the increasing choices available. In other words, that is the action that you are taking, and maybe more simplistic and maybe less policy oriented and more action oriented. And again, my only comment here would be that, again, in my experience in the municipal sector, is sometimes we may try to do too much too early, and then it becomes more policy focused, and sometimes we get lost in the implementation. And I'm sure there's probably others on this call that might share that view.
Fair enough. Yep. Okay, so there's a quick look at the logic model, and as I said, there are some details in your workbook if you wanted to return to that. All right, we're going to add the next layer of this look at outcomes, and coming back to the idea of asking the right questions and of whom. It's difficult to know how to evaluate something unless you've got a clear objective of what you want to accomplish. And so these are very similar to the outcomes that we just talked about. What are the changes you want to see? There are sort of 3 dimensions to an objective, and this chart does not go horizontally, it's just vertical. So we've seen in the logic model that you can have short, medium, and long term. So timing of the objectives can be one of the features that you'd look at. These examples are just examples. You'd set your own timeframes for what those are. The focus of the objective can be on, we've talked about the first one and the third one here. It could be change that you're looking for at the individual level or at the organizational or systemic level. This network level is an interesting one, and increasingly of interest with the social media kinds of approaches with this. A network objective would talk about change within a group of people. And so I'll use Erin's example in Aurora about the coaches circle, where you could think of that group of female coaches as a network. And what are the kinds of changes you want to see within the group? So it would be a sort of a sum of all the parts. And trying to then see that change, you'd work with opinion leaders in that circle, who is influential with the other people around them, and that if they were to endorse something or take up a different practice in some way, that they would tend to influence the other people within their network. I see this one related a lot to youth, where in terms of whatever, and often very informal networks, and what influences the behavior of youth, and trying to identify who those people are within that network. So it's quite a different approach, and there's a whole theory of work around this called the network analysis, and it's built on what's called the diffusion of innovations theory, if you want any more information on that. The third one we've talked about already, the difference between process and outcome objectives. So what are the changes that you're seeing in what you're doing and what you're accomplishing? We're going to play with this acronym down here in a moment with the SMART type of objectives. You've probably heard this before. In my mind, in my vernacular, this SMART acronym does apply to an objective where you're trying to get very specific, less so at the goal level, where these are directional kinds of statements. So these ones, you're really trying to get as specific as you can, as measurable as you can, attainable, results oriented, and sometimes you see this one as realistic, but I'm of the mind that realistic and attainable are often too close. So the results oriented means that you're actually getting somewhere. It's tied to the goals that you've set, the broader, longer term changes, and that they're time limited or time bound. So that what's the time frame within which you're trying to make that achieve that outcome. So I'm just going to give you some examples here. A little kind of phrase that I use to try and construct outcome objectives are how much of what will happen to whom or what by when. So how much, that's usually a numerical kind of benchmark. What is it actually you're trying to change? And to whom or what. So the whom is obviously at the individual or personal level, and the what might be about a network or an organization, and the when brings in the time frame. So this tries to get at each of the features of a SMART objective. There are some examples in your workbook on page 47, and I've pulled out a few of them, or not, I created these ones that are more gender equity focused rather than just physical activity, which is in the handbook. So examples: increase the number of women or gender diverse people on our board of directors by 30% over the next 3 years. It's pretty specific, measurable. It does mean that you need to know what the number is now. Well, in this case, it's a pretty evaluable benchmark. Second one is redesign 60% of current change rooms to be gender neutral by December 2022. And then a third one, girls, women, and gender diverse people have equitable access to primetime facility space by June of 2023. And that one, you'll notice it doesn't have a number in it because it implies that it's all. So it's not a percentage of the population that's going to have equitable access, but everyone will. And you could certainly include that if you wanted. One little hint, and this is often one of the biggest challenges I find. People often will write an objective starting with a verb, and that verb means it's something you're doing. That's a clue that it's a process rather than an outcome. So if you were writing things like to provide, or to train, to orient, to deliver, to communicate, all of those are verbs. If you don't remember grade 3 grammar, it's a long time ago for me. Those action words denote what you'll do. So those are more that process or activity kind of level, as opposed to the kinds of statements that are here that talk about the degree and the type of change you want to see. Okay, so we're going to have a chance to practice this a little bit and go back into our mural canvas to do this. I'll share with you first the kind of the task, and then we'll go into the board to do it. In this way, we're going to do it in 2 ways. MJ is going to set us up into 3 breakout groups for about 5 minutes, and we'll each breakout room will have a sample objective, and your task is to improve it, to make it more smart or smarter. So there'll be a facilitator in each of the rooms. Claire will be in one, I'll be in another, and I think MJ, if you're able to take the third one.
Erin is here.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, then we'll deliver Erin into that room. Thank you. So keep in mind this little statement of how much of what will change in whom or what by when. I'm going to cut back this time just a little bit, and then when we come back to a large group, the facilitator will just post on Mural your response, so we can see what the three were. So the objectives that you're going to work with is the program from Sport England called This Girl Can, which was a 3-phased campaign to tackle that fear of judgment that I spoke about earlier. And women, and the sort of trend that women were persistently less active than men. So I won't go through all these details, but they basically have 3 phases of their campaign. The first one was delivering messages in new places where women were. And so trying to be a bit bold in, for instance, looking at commercials on Coronation Street was one of the new places they went. Then phase 2, they learned from phase 1 what worked better and what didn't. They went into more long-term sustainable growth to create regular habits and increase the resilience of women who drop in and out of activity. And they extended the campaign to include women aged 40 to 60 as a very specific target. And then thirdly, the phase that they have completed now addressed the stark inequalities in exercise levels between different groups of women. So that intersectionality kind of piece came to play in this, encouraged women to overcome the social, cultural, and economic barriers, preventing them from having the confidence and motivation to exercise regularly. So here are the objectives that they identified to reflect their phases. So breakout group 1, you're going to have this objective number 1 to work with. That'll be Claire's group. I'll have question 2 or objective 2, and Erin, you'll have question 3. Folks, for doing that, let's just kind of look at these changes. So I'm in the group 2, so you'll see on the mural board the initial objective read, change how they feel and think about exercising and playing sport. So what we came up with as an alternative to try and make it smarter was to change how women over 60, instead of the word they, feel, because they had actually a mixed objective there where it was both think and feel, and to be specific, an objective should only really be trying to measure one thing. So similarly, they were feeling about exercising in sport, so we broke it down into just sport. So there might be another different objective that dealt with exercise and added the dimension of in the next 6 months. So change how women over 60 feel about sport in the next 6 months. Okay. Anyone from my group want to add to this from our conversation?
Nancy?
Yes.
I was just going to say, for this one, could you share like how you plan to measure how women feel? Because then that would help clarify what the evaluation tools might be.
Actually, that came up in our conversation. So yes, measuring emotions, it can be done in a number of different ways. You could ask on a survey, for example, just with giving a continuum of the types of words that might reflect feelings, and identify the ones that you identify with the last time you participated in a sport or exercise. Or it could be more of an interview kind of format where you might be looking at describe the way in which you felt. So it's more of a qualitative assessment of their emotional feelings during the activity. Also, the time frame that we chose in here was deliberate in that from that logic model, you saw that the initial changes are usually cognitive in nature and can happen fairly quickly. So initially we had changing these feelings in the next 3 to 5 years, but that reality is those feelings and thoughts, that knowledge level can change pretty quickly. And so the timing of when you might evaluate something could also be shorter than some of the longer term shifts. Okay, let's go to Erin now, if you would, to look at the original and the shift.
Sure. Thanks, Nancy. So our group talked about the original goal that was quite vague. Change the opportunities available to women to become active. And we got a little bit more specific in a couple of areas, both in the language around change, because we wanted to be find a way to easily measure that. So we changed that to increase. And the opportunities we found also quite non-specific. So we took that and made it a little bit more clear about increasing the number of unique programs. So different programs, not just one and repeating it a whole bunch of times, but the number of unique programs available to women to become active by 25% within 1 year. So hopefully we've hit all 5 of those SMART goals. Took a little bit of conversation, but we got there.
I really like the increase instead of change, because change could actually be negative. You could go down.
That's exactly what I was going to say about that middle one as well. Like you might want to add the qualifier of positively change, because technically if people's perceptions decreased over the year, you have changed and you've succeeded in that goal in a way that you did not want to.
Yeah, you actually went backwards. Good. Okay, Claire, we come to yours.
Okay, we had a good conversation about one of the points was, we're just how realistic is it coming, just recovering from COVID and talking about increasing when we're really concerned about reaching the levels of participation that we were at pre-COVID. But this is just a high-level discussion, but we did raise the point. We felt that we needed to be specific in terms of percentage. We should have baseline and how much we want to increase. We also included gender diverse people, but also a timeline. And one of the organizations represented felt that a 10% increase could be, in terms of memberships, could be achievable by the end of the year. So we reflected that, and we were specific about timelines and a percentage increase.
Excellent. Okay. Yeah, that sounds good. So thank you everybody for your input to this. Are there any questions that you have at this stage with respect to these objectives, particularly outcome objectives? One of the things I'll just mention as a bit of a tip is that nobody likes doing this. I actually like writing objectives, but I'm not normal in that respect. So it's often very challenging to get some sort of committee or group of people to agree on objectives. It's much easier, I think, to have one or two people put their heads together and draft something for then others to look at, or even just leave it to the people who are skilled or interested in this kind of work. It's not for everybody, but it's a necessary piece of the planning and evaluation loop. Okay, I just want to wrap this piece up by pointing to a page in your workbook. We're not going to go to it, but I just wanted to make sure you know these are here. For each of these steps that we're going through, there is a worksheet that I've pulled the questions from into our exercises. And so for step 2, it's on page 19, that has the sort of the sequence of the things that you'd go through to actually develop this evaluation aspect to your program. What we're going to move into now is the step 3, which is called focusing the evaluation. And the worksheet for this one is on page 22, if you wanted to follow along in there at all. So this now, if you follow, we know who the stakeholders are and what their sort of interest is in all of the in this particular program. Oh shoot, just a second, I got to do something different. Bear with me 1 second. Okay. And then just in the step that we've just finished, we've got a good sense of the direction of the evaluation that we wanted to take it in. Now we got to get specific with the details. And so 2 little phrases that help me to distinguish between this process and outcome. And again, back to our theme of today, outcome and good questions to ask. So are we looking to prove or improve? So if we're trying to prove something, this program is effective, then that's an example of an outcome. Whereas the improve is a process. Okay, how can we make the program better? What are elements that can be improved? Then the other one's different way to say the same thing. Are we doing things right, or are we doing the right things? So doing things right are the process things. Is the program running smoothly? Are we doing the right things means, are we having the effect that we really want? So those are just a couple different ways to keep track of this. So the start to this step, focus the evaluation, is on generating evaluation questions. So what do we want to know? I'm just going to check something here. Yeah. Oh, okay. These are, again, in your workbook. I won't read these all to you, but these are the kinds of things that you might want to know as a result of an evaluation, an outcome evaluation. And certainly there could be others. This isn't a definitive list by any means. What we're going to have a look at is going back to our mural board to talk about our stakeholders and what they might want to know as a result of undertaking an evaluation. So I'll give you an example first before we go into the activity. So this comes from a handbook that's available from CWS on a program called On the Move that you may be familiar with. And these are the questions that they have attached to this particular initiative. So what benefits were experienced by a variety of stakeholders? Our opportunities for girls and young women, who are the focus of this particular program, are opportunities for them to participate in sport and physical activity more readily available at the recreational level? Did the participants learn skills that will make them more comfortable in physical activity environments? Are staff and volunteers more aware of the barriers to participation in physical activity faced by girls and women? And have successful partnerships been formed within the community? So these are the changes that they want to be able to measure. And you can appreciate that some of these are very operational kinds of things. Some of them are about the reach of the, like who's participating in the programs, the numbers and their comfort level, their changes in skills. So there are a variety of purposes for these various questions. So what I'm going to ask you to do is we're going to go back into Mural as a large group, and MJ's reorganized the stickies that we identified. Remember, we put the magnifying glass on some of them, and we put the justice scale on some of the others. We're going to look specifically at the ones with the magnifying glass. And here's your activity, should you choose to accept it. In the using the van play example again, so the same stickies will be there. Just focus on the ones that have the magnifying glass on them. So the other ones will be moved out of the way. This time, what I'm going to ask you to do is to generate on some green stickies that will be there for you to use. So you do the same thing, just double click on it and write in it. What do you think? And it doesn't have to be perfectly worded, but what do you think that stakeholder would want to know about the evaluation of van play? What would their interest be? Okay, and again, probably going to have to, just make it up, but I want to get to in the mode of thinking about what do stakeholders want to know. MJ, I'm going to come to you in just a minute to see if we're ready for this. Does anybody have any questions? Nope. Okay, let me get rid of this.
I have a question. Nancy,
yes.
Do you want us to generate one sticky for each one, or people should? Okay.
Yeah, I
think that's what I did. Okay.
Yes, I think so. Okay, so let's go into Mural. And just move your cursor over to get, oops, I moved something. Over to get to the, oh. Did you put these in a new place, MJ?
Yes, they're in a new place. So they're in, if I'm gonna just tell people to follow me. So if you could just follow me here. So okay. They're now in activity 4, focus and evaluation. So if you could just go in here and start to type what the evaluation questions would be for Derek, city programmers, park or recreation departments, rec managers, advocacy groups, community leagues, non-profit organizations, and recreational sport organizations.
Excellent. Okay. Okay. Type away. Pile your questions in there. And MJ, where do we go to get another sticky?
Just click twice in here and you can reshape it.
Okay. Okay, finish up the one that you're writing on now, if you're in the middle of anything. And let's see what we've got. Okay, Derek, feel free to jump in here in terms of, I'm not going to go through all the questions, but you can see the variety, and if there's any that are really particularly poignant or that have actually come up in conversations. So have a read through what others have posted here. And at this point in the planning process for an evaluation, what you'd look for are overlap in some of these questions where you likely at the end of the day, when you brainstormed all these various questions, and in reality, you'd like to go and ask these people specifically, what do they want to know as a result of this? It's not you trying to predict what they want, but to actually find it out. So it wouldn't be quite this third party kind of idea. But then at this stage, you've probably got more questions than you have the resources to answer. And so you've got to look at really two things, a combination of which questions just absolutely have to be answered. So there may be not a lot of choice. So for instance, if you had a grant that you've applied for that has specific reporting requirements that you have to gather that particular information, then so be it. There may be some people or individuals like the Parks Board where they're going to have some pretty specific questions at the end of the day, and best to know those up front, but you might not have a whole lot of choice in answering those. The second level is then to say there's a theme here where there's a lot of people, there's a lot in here. What I'm looking at just quickly is around participation. And so what are all the different aspects of participation that we want to know about? And then you take it to the next level of who do we ask this of and how are we going to get the information? So that's the next layer of the focusing the evaluation, is to actually get down to the methodology as to how will we find this out. Is it a survey? Is it an interview? Is it observational? There's all different types of ways that you can find these things out. Okay, so start broad, and then you want to try and narrow it down. Any other observations, questions, or comments with what's there?
One thing that's coming to my mind that we maybe missed on this, kind of this top row of folks is they're asking what needs to change in the current structure of things, right? So a lot of van play is a reallocation, not only just new resources, but a reallocation of current resources. And so we really need to know, based on how successfully different initiatives are going and kind of what the prioritization passed down from our leadership is. Like, how do we need to better reallocate our current resources? And where do we need to address maybe more additional resources? So kind of this whole top row is always evaluating allocation of resources and needing to know who needs it most.
Excellent. Yep. And so there's a cost factor there. You've got staff requirements. So there's a resourcing element. Okay, good. Thank you, Derek. All right. Let's go back to the slides. Thanks, MJ. And we're going to finish off with one last element of all of this. So just a second. It'll bring us back. Okay, I'm just going to skip over this piece and get us to an introduction to this step 4 about gathering credible evidence. So now you've got who you want to ask to get the information from, your stakeholders. We've got the idea of making sure we are describing our program in a way that we've thought it well out, and what are the changes we're wanting to identify. Asking the good questions around what stakeholders need to know and which of those we can manage. Now we want to figure out the method. How are we going to attach, or how are we going to find this information? So lots of people will take this kind of attitude, get all the information you can, and we'll think of a use for it later. I don't know how many times I've seen so much data that's been captured and nobody knows what to do with it. They don't use it. It's just a bit of a waste. So this is where this link to indicators comes in. So these are statements that link what you want to see happen to how will we know that it did happen. So you've written some good objectives at the outcome level, and now we need to know exactly what the question that MJ brought up in our objective discussion is around. How can we get that information? It may be very straightforward. You count the number of people that are registered, and it's that simple. How do you get at people's feelings and what their level of knowledge is? In lots of sports, there's good methods of assessing skill level in terms of the level at which participants play. So those are the kinds of things that would fit in as indicators. There's two different kinds of indicators. One is a direct one where you're counting, you're measuring it directly. It's straight. It's worded almost exactly the same way as your objective is: the number of women and girls who participate in sport X in the next 1 year. Others are what I call proxy indicators, where you can't really get at it directly. So what would indicate, hence the word indicator, that you're getting closer to that? And so this final bullet point down here, the percentage of girls aged 12 to 19 with a more positive opinion of the facility. You saw in that one of the earlier slides about the issue around gender equity is people are not feeling welcome in a facility. So I'm going to ask you as a group, what might indicate that girls in that age range have a more positive opinion of the facility? What kinds of things would you look for, or information could you gather that would give you that kind of information?
In the chat, Samuel has put returning visits to a facility.
Sure. They're probably not going to come back to a place that they didn't enjoy. So that would be an example of a proxy indicator. Any others come to mind?
Bring in a friend. It's a big indicator.
Sure.
If you feel comfortable there, you might recommend, but not just recommend it, actually bring them to participate in an activity with you.
Exactly.
And I would say the length of time they're staying, because if they're comfortable, they might hang out in a social area and you might see them for a longer time.
Yeah. And that sort of social congregation where they might not actually even be there to do an activity or play a sport, but rather they're there to hang out with their friends. They're comfortable in the lounge area or the kitchen or whatever you might have available. Okay. There are samples of indicators in your workbook. This is step 4, and there's a whole appendix with lots of them on it. And we also we sent this to you by email ahead of time last Thursday, this temperature check assessment that CWS has put together. And the phrases that they use to establish, here's how we're doing in gender equity, those are all indicators, and they're grouped into categories. So there's a lot in here that I think you can build on. Some of them, the categories that CWS has used is, how are we doing in the area of policies and practices? So looking at changes within those kinds of elements, the organizational culture, that feeling of belonging or welcomeness, and the commitment and readiness in the organization to address gender equity. So these are sort of readiness indicators. A little bit here on the side of just the difference between quality indicators and quantity, that you may not be able to measure everything. So like the questions, you may have to pare things down to what's reasonable and manageable to be able to do, and most insightful. It's going to be of most use to you. Okay, so I'll leave those with you as a way to think about it. And then lastly, this idea of methods of where you will get the data. And again, the workbook has some more information on these. And they could be from people, from documents, observations, existing data that's already out there. The question came up from Ron earlier about where do you find some of this data that you could compare your own community to and look at comparable communities, that sort of thing. And then lots of information around the various types of data gathering methods. So certainly surveys aren't the only thing to be able to do. And it's actually been interesting over COVID to see how people have done, not so much in recreation because so little has been happening in various ways, unfortunately, but also looking at more than just a survey to be able to think about how to get information from people. Okay. So I want to leave you with a case study example that you can go online to get this full report. I'm not going to go through the details here, but it's a summary of the This Girl Can campaign at Sport England. And so the report, I haven't pulled it all out here, but gives you a really good sense of the evaluation, not only process, but findings. And so it's organized by the phases that I described earlier, and they've got some good data as well as the insights into what happened. So they have direct results. Then they've determined the impact. Remember that sort of at the end of phase one, what did we really learn through this whole thing, putting all the pieces together? And then what was our return? So they've got some economic indicators in here. And then lastly, what have we learned that takes us into the next phase? And so there's these 4 kind of summary statements for each of the 3 phases. So I didn't put them all in here, but if you're interested in the detail and using this one as an example, I think you'll find it very consistent with what we've talked about today. There are case studies in your workbook. Again, they're not gender equity based, but they're physical activity based if you want to have a look at those as more information. I think I will, well, I'll just speak to this quickly. This also came to you in that original or that initial email. It's something we put together just for this project. So it is very specific to gender equity, and it's a tool that helps you to assess where you're at or what the next steps are for you. So as you have come into this workshop and perhaps some of the other ones, the hope is that you use some of the information to take some steps back home within your own organization. And so it's a planning sheet to help you figure out how you might do that. And these are just the categories of the questions that are laid out on a form. So it's just a tool to be able to help you focus where you might go next in tackling something about gender equity. And I'll finish with just a little bit on the other resources that are available. Erin mentioned in the video up front about our gender equity toolkit. So MJ, I'm wondering if you could pop that URL into the chat for us, please. And it's got, it will grow certainly over time, but it's got all of the recordings that it will have all the recordings from our workshops, the resources that have come forward, in things that we've gathered through interviews, all sorts of things in there. So by all means, have a look in there as well. And since we're talking about evaluation, we better have an evaluation. So a couple of different ways for you to do this, if you wouldn't mind taking a few minutes, and we'll do it now if you can. You can take a snapshot of the QR code here if you want on your phone, or go to this link. Again, you can maybe put that in the chat box for people to go to. It's very short, very quick, but it does help us. We've still got one more of these workshops to do, and we want to make any additional changes that are possible in the next iteration of all of these. So in closing, with the next steps here, I have mentioned that the slides will be available on the website, cpra.ca. The toolkit and the bench are resources for you to be able to access after today. And we'd also love to hear from you as we build this toolkit. We're in the process of creating a community of practice where we have the opportunity to connect with one another on different topics related to gender equity, and would love to hear your stories, your examples of things that you found that have been particularly helpful. If your community has taken on an initiative that others might want to hear about or you'd like to speak about, we'd love to have input in that way. So you can certainly get back to any of us by email. Probably the one you've got at hand is MJ's as the material came out through there. So just feed it back to us as anything that you'd either like to see or like to contribute to that toolkit. I'd like to just finish off by thanking Claire for your help and Erin in facilitating some of the group discussion. MJ, all your background and upfront work with all of the pieces, and Derek for letting me put you on the spot with your van play initiative. I'm so glad you were there. So thank you for that. Most of all, the big thanks goes to you as the participants. It's really all about what you can take away from this and what you will learn. So I really appreciate your participation today. We've got a minute or two left. If anyone has questions, or I'd be happy to stay on the line for a little bit if there is anything you'd like to ask or add. Anybody? Nope. Okay, then at 2:59, I say we're done. Thank you all again. Take care, and hopefully our paths will cross again. Bye-bye.
I vote.
Thank you so much, Nancy and everyone.
Thank you.